So let's paint this really pretty pansy using really delicate, subtle tones. We have a free trace down drawing, as you can see, and we'll give you details later on. So I'm going to be using these Derwent Inktense pencils to do this tutorial, and I'm only going to be using a handful of colours to paint this. So I'm going to be using mixed media paper for this tutorial, and as you can see, I've just traced down my drawing like this. You can of course draw it freehand, but this makes it really quick and really easy so that we can get on with the important part, applying colour. So all of the brushes that I'm going to be using, I will link in the description box underneath this video. And here are the colours that I've selected: dark chocolate, red violet and a mixture of the two, as well as Chinese ink, mauve and golden yellow. So just a handful of colours, and just to say that these colours can be bought individually. You don't have to buy them in a set. You can just go out and buy the odd one or two as you need them. So before we start the tutorial, I just want to demonstrate how we can use these colours. So as you can see, the trick is to use a really sort of light, gentle touch. You don't want to have any pencil marks on the paper. So once you activate these pencils with water, then you get your ink-like quality like this, as I'm showing you here. So just think of it as a way of getting your pigment onto the paper. So the paper that I'm using to do the tutorial is a mixed media paper, and I have tried it with different types of watercolour paper, and so far the mixed media paper that I'm using today is the one that sort of came out better. So all we have here is a clean glass of water, some kitchen paper to blot, and we are good to go. You can see that I've swatched out the colours on the side of this little piece of paper here, and I've got some water in the middle of my palette, and this is super important, and I'll tell you why in a minute. You can see that I just added a tiny bit of water to the pigment that I've swatched out on the watercolour paper to the side here, and I'm just using the brush, a damp brush, to pick up some of that pigment and apply it, as you can see. The colour that I've picked up is a mixture of dark chocolate and red violet, and I've simply put the dark chocolate down first and just then applied the red violet pencil on the top, and that's completely dry, and then activated it with a little bit of water, and you can see I'm just picking up tiny little bits of that pigment and dropping it into the wet paint, as you can see here. The trick with this painting is to have really subtle colours you can just about see the delicacy of, and you can still achieve really sort of subtle, delicate tones even with the Inktense pencils, which have a really strong, vibrant colour. Notice how I'm using the tiny little puddle of water on my palette to the left just to clean my brush and apply the correct amount of water. We don't want to flood the paper with water because then it will just become buckled and you'll have too much pigment and you will lose control. I'm using my number 8 round here. This is a faux squirrel brush, and it has a relatively fine point, which means I can just about get the correct amount of water onto the brush. I'm using Chinese ink here. This is a kind of sort of dark black colour, and you can see how lightly I'm applying it to the outside areas of the petals, which just have that kind of delicate grey tone. We don't want this colour to look black, we just want a really subtle grey tone to just start off our layering process. When you're working with Inktense pencils, so they are an ink-based pencils and they are permanent when they're dry, it's kind of the same process as working with watercolour. So we're going to be working in layers, working from light to dark, making sure that each layer is dry before we apply the next. Now, watercolour is renowned for having that kind of tricky phase where your painting doesn't look right and it looks, we call the ugly duckling phase, and it's the same process for these inks. Keep in mind that this is the process and it's absolutely correct for it not to look right as you're working through. So I highly recommend that you watch this video all the way through so that you can see that tricky process unfold and see your painting come to life. Notice how I'm just picking up the colours on my swatch card here and using the ink like this, just in the way I would use a watercolour. These Inktense pencils are highly blendable and buildable so that you can have a strong colour if you want to, and again the delicate colours that we need for this painting. Now, I said at the beginning of this tutorial that we have a free reference photograph, which I've kept on screen for you here, as well as a line drawing for you to trace down if you want to. Now, of course, you can draw it freehand, but as I said at the start, sometimes people just want to press on with the tutorial. So that you can access these, we've put them in our Facebook group, which I will link in the description box below. So do consider joining us. We are a lovely community, and of course, you can post up your finished paintings there and have some feedback from me and our other members. But also, I will put the line drawing and reference photograph at the end of this video, right at the very end. You can do a screenshot and print them out that way. So stay until the end of this video and you can do that and have access to it that way as well. So I'm now using Chinese ink and golden yellow to do this kind of grey tone on the bottom petals of the pansy, and you can see me just blending them into the paper like this. Everything's completely dry, and I'm just using these two colours here again. So we have dark chocolate and red violet, and I've just scribbled them onto the swatch card like that, ready to go again. And I'm now using the dark chocolate colour to add a tiny bit more of the darker value to the tips of the petals. This is my number 4 size spotter from Rosemary & Co. I'm a great fan of these brushes. If you're familiar with my tutorials, you have heard me mention these quite a lot in the past. They are very similar to a round brush, but have a smaller, stubbier bristle, which makes application of paint and blending paint super easy. So this is a number 4. These are synthetic brushes as well. And you can see how I'm manipulating that pencil and sort of pushing it into the paper like this. And as I've said, I've tried using sort of higher quality watercolor paper to do these paintings, but I found that the blending process was a little more tricky, and this mixed media paper makes it an absolute breeze. So we are building up the colors and the layers slowly and carefully. So I've picked up some of the mixture of the dark chocolate here on my brush with a tiny bit of the red violet. So we have that sort of light burgundy colour, and you can see how I'm patting my brush onto the kitchen paper to blend it out like this. Just adding a tiny bit of golden yellow because I did feel there was an element of a yellow tone on the bottom part of this pansy. So if you're wondering why Inktense pencils as opposed to watercolour, well, I suppose they have more of a vibrancy about them, and also some people don't like watercolour. This can be an alternative method if you just don't like using watercolour, and sometimes you can just directly put your watercolour pencil right onto the paper, as I'm doing here, and it just means you have maybe a little bit more control. So if watercolour maybe isn't your thing and you want to switch it up a little bit by using something different, then do give these pencils a try because they are absolutely amazing to use. And you can see me using my I think it's a number 0 size brush here. This is from Panart Global art supplies, which they very kindly sent me. This has a fine point. And this is a number 0 round brush here, and I'm using, this is the mauve, just picking this colour up from my swatch card, and you can see how I'm using this kind of wiggly motion to create a little bit of a pattern there using the tip of my number 0 brush. If you're struggling with watercolour and you find that you want to try something a little bit different, then why not give these a go? They're relatively inexpensive if you buy them individually, and I will link all of the products that I'm using in the description box underneath this video. I'm using the mauve pencil here on top of the washes I've already applied. Now it's really important that your washes are completely dry before you do this, and I've also added a tiny bit of the golden yellow. When I've got that colour in place, you can see once again I'm activating the colour with my damp number 4 spotter and just taking a careful look at the reference photograph and sort of drawing that colour into the areas that I feel have that particular tone, and once again blending it out with my damp brush. Just creating a little bit more colour here. You can see that I've applied the colour onto the wet paint, and by doing that it's actually stained the paper and made it really, really difficult to blend. Fortunately in this instance we needed that pattern anyway, so it wasn't the end of the world, but just keep in mind that when you apply your wet pencil on top of an already wet paper, this is what will happen, and it will give you an intense colour, but it will make the blending a little bit more tricky for you. So just keep that in mind. You can see here that it's really, really hard for me to move. So when you put your pencil on top of your wash, make sure that your wash is completely dry. So here you can see me picking up the colours from the swatch card here, and I'm dropping this into the wash that I've applied. Now, because this is wet in wet, as it were, it won't matter if you're working from your swatches to drop it in, but don't apply your pencil straight on to the wet washes, if that makes sense. So I have a little bit of that Chinese ink here. Notice how light that colour is, and how I'm just creating this gentle shadow, and where the sort of base of that petal is, and also in the center. It's all about creating these really sort of gentle hues as you work through. You want your flower to look as if it's got dimension and form, as well as those really gentle, subtle colors. And by working them in small areas one at a time like this, you can see how it separates the petals from each other, also creating the other dimension with your sort of slightly darker values. So here I'm putting a little bit of golden yellow with the mixture of dark chocolate and red violet. By the way, if you don't have any of these materials, use what you have. If you have your own set of Inktense pencils, or indeed any other watercolour pencil, then give it a go. I'm dropping in a tiny bit of Chinese ink there, and also the dark chocolate and the red violet mix here, using a tiny bit of pigment at a time and just blending it through with a damp brush, as you can see me doing here. Okay, so everything's dry again, and you can see me here picking up this this beautiful mauve colour and going over the initial wash that I've applied. As I said, it's really important that the pigments are dry before you do this, otherwise you'll get the streaking, as I mentioned earlier before. You don't want any messy lines. So once I've applied that colour like this, you can see I'm using my tiny little zero size brush here with a fine point to pull that pigment into place and create the tiny little veins that are starting to appear, as you can see me doing here, using a small puddle of water in my palette, because that means I've got full control rather than dipping my brush into the jar of water, which will flood the brush with water, meaning that I lose that pigment. So by having this tiny little puddle of water on my palette here, it just means I have better control. Because we're working in small areas at a time, we don't want to flood the brush with water, otherwise we will just have too much water on the paper and it just won't work. So a tiny little puddle of water on your palette is all you need. And with a damp paper, you can see how I'm dropping in that pigment wet on wet, and the paint will naturally splurge into the water that we've applied and have that softer look, as you can see me doing here. So this is kind of our template, our sort of template washes, and we can build them up as we work through. So here we have, once again, the golden yellow along with the red violet. And because it's completely dry, we can go in a little bit more heavy-handed now, given that really strong base colour, and going over with the red violet. Just keeping an eye on the reference photograph, and once the colour is in place, going back in with my number 0 round brush like this, and activating that paint to create this sort of beautiful burgundy tone that has a definite yellow undertone, as you can see from the photograph. So this is red violet, once again going on the dry wash and going over it again with the golden yellow pencil, and just activating it with my number 4 spotter. We have actually another video using Derwent Inktense Pencils, and if that's something that you'd like to take a look at, I will put an information card on the top of your screen right now, so you can click through to that and watch it after this video. So once again, everything's dry, and I'm using mauve here, straight onto the mixed media paper as before, and just with a really light touch, and once again a little bit of Chinese ink here to enhance the middle, and a little bit of definition going on here on the outside edge of the petals. Now it's really important that you have a light touch here. You don't want the petals to look grey. All you're doing is adding a little bit of tonal value and a little bit of contrast. And now the same with the dark chocolate on the top, and activating with my number 0 round. You can see I've added a tiny bit of water to the paper there, so that when I'm moving that ink into the paper, you have a tiny little reservoir of water to sort of merge it into. It just makes the blending process a little bit easier. So a little bit of a tip there, just add your water to the paper so that you have somewhere to manipulate that paint into, like this. And it just gently merges into that tiny puddle of water to make it a nice soft edge. And just blending it out using the tip of my brush, and I'm beginning to create some veins, carrying on that line that I've applied and just taking it into the petal itself with that tiny little outline of that grey tone. So if you are new here, thank you for joining us. And just to let you know that we do upload new content every single Tuesday. They will be full-length painting tutorials. So you may want to consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that little bell notification so that you don't miss new content when it's uploaded. We are also on Instagram at The Wonders of Watercolour, so do take a look at us there and give this video a big thumbs up if you're enjoying it. I just want to take a moment to tell you about our Patreon, which at the time of filming has 4 different membership levels, from mini weekly videos of doodles, vlogs and podcasts to full-length botanical painting tutorials, which are exclusive to Patreon and are of course ad-free. If this is something that interests you, I've put a link in the description below, plus it's a way for you to support my channel. So continuing the process with this beautiful Chinese ink colour, you can see I'm just working around the outside edge of the pansy like this. And now I'm using my number 8 round brush to do a plain water glaze. This is something I like to do sort of midway through the painting, and it just merges everything together and gives it a sense of uniformity. But it's really important that you let this go completely dry before attempting anything else. So I'm just using this is the mauve colour to create some shape and some depth of colour here on the inside of the pansy petal, and I'm also putting in a few veins, as you can see, using my number 0 round, and just enhancing a few little areas here and there. And just the residual pigment on my brush here to create some veins. And it's also important that you see the direction in which the veins are going, because this will give the viewer the idea that the petal has a curve. You don't want them to be a straight line, just keep in mind that your veins will need to go in the direction of the petal. So once again, I'm just glazing over with water, and I'm just dropping in some of the pigment wet in wet to give that lovely sort of soft outline. I'm adding some yellow tone to the Chinese ink again, and you can see the subtlety of this colour. And just by applying this to the base of this petal here, you can see how it pulls away the adjoining petal, making it look as if it's standing out, giving it a bit of depth and form. And again, by adding this tiny bit of Chinese ink to the base of this petal here, it makes the adjoining petal stand out. And of course, once again, just adding a bit of shading, as you can see here. And just carrying on the process with this tiny bit of grey tone, which is of course the watered down Chinese ink, to create some depth. And I'm outlining with a tiny bit of mauve. Notice by using the tip of my brush, just by giving it that tiny sort of outline, you can see it really makes it jump out, and I'm just dropping in some Chinese ink to give it a little bit more of a sort of shadow where you can see here. As you can see, I dropped some golden yellow ink onto the paper, but just by using bits of kitchen paper that's damp, I've just easily lifted that out. And that is one of the joys of the mixed media paper. In this instance, it lifted out quite easily, but I have had difficulty lifting it out in the past, just to mention that. Sometimes it's easier to lift out than others, but I've got away with it this time. Okay, so going back to the colours here, I'm using Chinese ink with the tip of my number 0 round, and I'm just outlining the pansy like this. As I'm pulling up the colour, this is the mauve colour, you can see that I'm creating a few veins. I'm not going absolutely true to the photograph, I'm just creating 1 or 2 veins as I work through like this. So I'm just strengthening up some of the colours now where I feel it is needed. Once again, sharpening up the sort of the areas where the 2 petals join, and just picking up that pigment. This is a mixture of red violet and dark chocolate again to enhance the areas that I need to. By using this tapping motion, picking up the colours and just working through. I definitely needed to have some darker values here, so once again I'm using the same mix of red violet and dark chocolate, working wet on dry with the brush here, as you can see, to create this really darker value in the middle of this petal. Blending it out again with my number 0 brush, and as I'm blending it through, you'll see that I'm pulling down some of that pigment to create some veins as I work through. Softening those edges through and pulling that pigment down. Patting my brush dry and blending. So by working in smaller areas at a time, you can see that you have full control. And I'm now going to pull this pigment down because it has a central vein that's quite prominent, but still using a light touch. We don't want it to look artificial. We want to keep it as natural looking as possible. So by using the residual paint that's on the brush, you can see how I'm just pulling that down. Really, really gently, just picking up a little bit more pigment because I did feel it was a little bit too subtle. And whatever's left on the brush, just pulling those shapes out like this. Just really, really soft. I'm just using my flat synthetic brush here to eradicate any hard edges. This is just a damp brush. So I'm just adding a little bit more contrast here. This is the Chinese ink. We want the petal to look as if it's standing off the paper, and by adding this little bit of tonal value, tonal contrast here and there, it makes that painting stand out. And again, adding a few veins with that really light mix. Some of your veins will have more of a purpley tone and some of them have more of a grey tone. So just keep that in mind when you're painting them in. You want them to look as natural as possible. And of course the lightness of them will matter. You don't want them to be too heavy, you want them to look really nice and natural. And just continuing the process and working through. So now it's just a case of repeating the process. We've still got a little way to go on this painting, but as usual at this point, I'm going to stop talking and let you watch the rest of this video in peace. So make sure that you stay right until the end so that you can have access to the line drawing and the reference photograph to join in with this tutorial if you want to, do a screenshot and of course print it out. And I hope you enjoyed this video. So thank you so much for watching and I'll see you next time.